So one of the early steps within this path of the social clock is trying to find a long-term partner and eventually settle down and get married. Within heterosexual relationships, there are pretty strong gender differences in the way that people go about finding a mate in terms of like the characteristics that they're looking for. It's been shown in a wide number of countries and cultures that women, for example, tend to place more emphasis on things like financial stability, intelligence, basically personality factors that are related to a sense of like commitment and the ability to share resources. Women tend to prefer men who are of the same age as them or slightly older. And women also tend to emphasize psychological fidelity more than physical fidelity, and also psychological intimacy. So they prefer that kind of emotional connection over the physical connection in general. Whereas men in general tend to emphasize basically traits that show fertility and youth. So things like attractiveness, domestic skills. Men tend to prefer a younger partner rather than an older partner, and also tend to prefer physical intimacy over emotional or psychological intimacy. One of the prominent theories that tries to explain these differences is evolutionary psychology, which basically says that these mate selection differences come from differences in basically the burden of childbearing, is the way they describe it. So the idea is that women, whenever a woman gets pregnant, she, by default has to devote at least 9 months of her life to taking care of this child in her body. And traditionally, at least, once the child was born, it's the woman's job to then take care of the child for the most part going forward. And so for a woman to have a kid, she has to invest a huge amount of time and effort and resources into one child. A man, on the other hand, according to this theory at least, can basically have an infinite number of children and doesn't have any real strong obligation to take care of that child necessarily. Again, I'm speaking historically, generally, and just from the perspective of this evolutionary theory. And so the idea is that if you're a woman, you can only have so many children, you have to spend a lot of time and effort, then you want a high quality mate that has lots of traits that are going to get you good resources and that indicate that that mate is going to be committed to you and give you some of those resources to help you take care of your child. A man, on the other hand, just wants basically a woman who is fertile so that he can spread his seed and have as many offspring as possible. Again, that's the idea of this evolutionary theory. There is some evidence that some of that is true, but there's also evidence that it's more cultural and environmental rather than a biological thing. So in societies where there's stronger gender equality, so where women have equal opportunities to get education and go into the workforce, things like that, these gender differences in mate selection are much lower. They're decreased. And mate selection preferences are more equal. So that suggests that there's at least some cultural and environmental influence to these mate selection preferences. I'll also point out, so even though there's these differences, none of these traits are necessarily at the top for men or women. It's just women tend to emphasize financial status more than men, and men tend to emphasize attractiveness more than women. But for most men and women, sort of the highest value that they place on attributes of their spouse or their partner are attributes that contribute to relationship satisfaction. So things like, is the person agreeable and warm and affectionate? Do they have a mutual caring for each other? Just those traits that probably any of us would say we're looking for in a partner in order to have a successful relationship. Most people also tend to select partners that are similar to themselves in age, occupation, education, race, pretty much every characteristic you can think of. There's that old saying that opposites attract, but that tends to actually not necessarily be true, at least not for long-term committed relationships. Most successful long-term relationships are between people who are fairly similar to each other in a number of dimensions. I will also say that's changing though, so there's, biracial marriages, things like that are becoming much more common and frequent than they used to be. So some of those similarities are obviously less important than other things. It's probably important that you share similar values, for example, that you have similar views on wanting to raise children, things like that, but not necessarily that you're similar in every aspect. Other things that influence mate selection and the quality and success of a relationship have to do with the bond between the person who's in the relationship when they were a child with their parent, and also just the timing of the relationship. I'm going to talk more about this early parent-child bond on the next slide, so I'll get to that in a minute. But by timing, I just mean a lot of times, someone may find someone who's right for them in all the ways we just discussed, but they're not ready for a commitment. They don't want to, get married or be in a committed relationship. And so even though these two people might be right for each other, it just doesn't work out because of the timing of them meeting or starting dating. So that relationship may fall apart due to that. So like I said, one of the factors that influences the success of a relationship has to do with the attachment style that someone had with their parents whenever they were a child. So like if I, for example, had a poor attachment style to my parents when I was a kid, then that may influence the way that I am in my relationships as an adult. And the idea here is that early attachment leads to this internal working model that we have about relationships and our expectations. So the way that your parents treat you and you interact with your parents when you're a kid basically influences how you view relationships, what you expect from a relationship, what you think you're going to get out of that relationship, etc. And so adults' evaluations of their early attachment experiences have been shown to correlate with their own parenting behavior and also with their interactions in romantic relationships. Partner attributes also influence that as well. So even if you have a poor attachment in childhood, if you find someone who you have a close, intimate connection with, then that may kind of overcome some of the issues that come from your insecure attachment style. And also these internal working models can be updated, and so even though you have maybe a poor working model of relationships in your teens, as you encounter more and more relationships, you can update that working model and kind of update those expectations to more closely match the relationships that you have actually experienced. And so this slide just shows, the different types of attachment styles. I'm trying to remember, I think we talked about this maybe in like earlier middle childhood. These attachment styles and how they can affect the child while they're a child. I also alluded to the fact that those attachment styles then can affect the way that you behave as an adult, and so this is just showing that. So basically, if you were, as a child, had a secure attachment to your parents, then you tend to have a working model of relationships that is, you're comfortable with intimacy, you're not afraid of being abandoned, and so you tend to have more successful relationships because those relationships are based on things like trust, happiness, friendship, etc. If you had an avoidant attachment style as a child, then you often will develop this working model of relationships that emphasizes independence, mistrust, and anxiety about being close to others. And so, of course, that can result in some difficulty in having successful relationships. You may believe that love is really hard to find. People who have had this avoidant attachment history are more likely to have just casual sexual encounters. They also experience jealousy, emotional distance, lack of support, and unrealistic beliefs about what a relationship should be like or what they should get out of a relationship. Those who have had a resistant attachment history tend to look for really fast love and want to merge very quickly. So they may jump into a relationship very fast and move very quickly, may want to, have a more serious relationship than their partner does, may want to get married very early, for example. They also tend to experience jealousy, but also desperation. They tend to have really emotional highs and lows within the relationship. So because they kind of jump into it so fast, their partner may feel very special, like, oh, this person really loves me right away, so that's great. But then you have, the jealousy and desperation that kind of sends the relationship crashing, and it may take on this sort of cyclical nature. They tend to try to offer support to their partner, but often have a hard time knowing what type of support to offer, and so that support may not be helpful. And they're also quick to express anger and fear within the relationship rather than some of those more positive emotions or positive sharing experiences. But again, overall point is that the attachment style you have in childhood can influence the way that you see and behave in relationships as an adult. As a relationship is developing, it often goes through kind of multiple phases, assuming that the relationship at least lasts long enough to get through all of these. And really these phases have to do with a shifting in the values that are placed on the relationship by the two people involved. Most relationships start with what is called passionate love. That's essentially where you have a really intense sexual attraction to someone. You may be really physically attracted to them, but in those initial phases you probably don't know the person very well. You may not know a lot about their values, the way they view the world, etc. And so the relationship at that point is more physical than it is emotional or intimate. Over time, typically that passion will start to fade away and will be replaced with commitment and intimacy if the relationship endures, at least. A lot of relationships will end after this passionate love phase, so people may go through that, then that passion may start to dissipate, and if it's not replaced by intimacy and commitment, then basically there's no point in being in the relationship anymore, so it may break up. But if the relationship endures, then you have that commitment and intimacy that transitions to what's called companionate love and compassionate love. Companionate love is where you have a warm, trusting, affectionate relationship with the other person. You start to value them for who they are, for their personality traits, for their values, etc. And then compassionate love is even a little more involved than that. It's where you have a real concern of the other person's well-being. You want to make sure that they are happy and try to avoid any sort of negativity brought onto them or distress. So it's expressed through caring efforts to alleviate others' distress and promote the partner's growth and flourishing. And so like I said, in most typical long-lasting relationships, you have that passionate love at first, it gradually declines, and then you have increases in both companionate and compassionate love. People who tend to get into these areas of relationships, who have successful relationships, a lot of it comes down to their communication abilities. So they're able to communicate commitment and intimacy to their partners. One of the primary factors that determines if a relationship will be successful or not is if the two partners can engage in what's called constructive conflict resolution. So all relationships are going to have fights and disagreements because no two people are exactly alike or are going to agree about everything. And so a successful relationship typically comes from being able to express those differences and disagreements in a way that's constructive and productive. So constructive conflict resolution typically involves, first of all, being open and accepting to share those disagreements directly rather than kind of like beating around the bush or trying to ignore problems. Listening patiently to the partner, asking for clarification if there's confusion, using skills like compromising. Also using humor during a fight has been shown to correlate pretty highly with relationship satisfaction and success. So if you can, if things are starting to get tense, it feels like there's a fight about to break out, then being able to like make a joke or sort of laugh things off, add that humor element, often will kind of dissipate the fight and result in more intimacy and commitment. And then also avoiding negative interactions, doing things like criticizing the other person, mocking or mimicking them, showing contempt or defensiveness, or one of the big things that can often result in divorce or dissipation of a relationship is what's called stonewalling, which is basically like using the silent treatment, not even like talking to the other person. So avoiding all of those negative things has been shown to help foster this companionate and compassionate love that leads to more successful, enduring relationships.